Thank you for joining us for today's session. I'm your host, Debbie Mathias with the BUILD Initiative. We'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement from Giovanna Archuleta, Assistant Secretary for the New Mexico Early Childhood Education and Care Department.
I would like to open up this meeting acknowledging our Mother Earth and the land she nurtures us with, the land where our children grow, and the land that provides the food to feed them. When we talk about these resources, we must also acknowledge the lands of our tribal people and the deep spiritual and long-standing relationship of all tribal nations. Today I come from you from Nambe-Awinga, the land of my ancestors who cared for it and fought for it so that I may one day live and raise my own children on it. A relationship that predates colonial contact by thousands of years. Our ancestors still speak to us and guide us through our songs, ceremonies, and writings. Through removal, trail of tears, long walks, assimilation, and the idea that by removing children would kill a culture. Our ancestors did not give up. Our tribal people are some of the most resilient people in our country, continuing to raise children to be resilient, who are nurtured through language and culture, the language and culture that cannot be removed. We must also acknowledge all other spirits who were forcefully displaced from their homelands and trafficked for labor and production on sacred native land. All of us collectively continue to experience the adversity that caused our ancestors and spirits who continue to hurt from actions done to them. Take a moment to pray these people find the healing and peace to raise their children in a world that has so many opportunities, but most importantly, create coexistence free of violence. Tribal people are praying people. This is where we are all tied. Our grandmothers and mothers continue to pray over us. And as tribal people pray, they pray for people in the north, in the east, in the south, and the west. They pray for infants, children, adults, and elders, and our non-human relations, each with knowledge to share with us. As this conference begins, I hope that each of you are balanced in all directions and take a moment to appreciate what Mother Earth has given to us and how she continues to nurture us in many ways. I invite and encourage you to learn who are the original stewards of the land you live and work on and support those nations and children of those lands. Thank you.
The BUILD team is excited to present this 20 webinars in 20 days for QRIS 2020 as we explore ideas, possibilities, and learn together about how we might recreate better, more equitable systems with children, families, and early childhood professionals at the center of our efforts. We're grateful to the many individuals who took time to prepare sessions, generate content, and ideas to share. We believe the sessions will inspire you to build on these ideas, continue conversations, and innovate back in your own communities and states. Gosh, we've learned a great deal as we've prepared for the virtual event. One of our lessons is that a virtual event draws a much broader audience than an in-person conference. The BUILD QRIS conference was designed for early childhood systems leaders at the national, state, territory, tribal, nation, and community levels. As registration rolled in for the virtual event, we discovered many direct service providers, from teachers to center directors and home-based providers signing up for the sessions. We welcome you to our learning community and look forward to hearing your perspectives. We encourage you to share your comments, ideas, and questions in the chat box. As you know, we had to pivot from our in-person conference to a virtual conference. We'd like to say a sincere thank you to our sponsors who made that switch possible. Their support is essential to this event. We've all become more familiar, maybe than we've wanted to be, with the Zoom platform over the past few months, as we've used it to connect with friends, family, community, and colleagues. We want to point out a few features that may be new to you. First, you can choose your view. In the upper right-hand corner, click on the speaker view to see the active speaker, or click on gallery view to see everyone who's on camera. Next, we encourage you to provide feedback throughout the session by clicking the participant icon along the bottom, and the participant list will open up. Then you can click on the icons at the bottom to respond to questions or give us a thumbs up or some feedback through the nonverbal feedback there. The presenters may also use this feature to do some quick polling, so be ready. Chat with us. We encourage you to be active participants in this section. Please share your ideas, experiences, and questions in the chat box. There will be a couple of polls in this section. A box will pop up on your screen, and we encourage you to respond. This helps us generate more conversation and enhances our learning together. Well, now for the best part. I'd like to turn it over to Teri Talan to introduce our session leaders and launch our session. Hi, Teri.
Hello. Well, I am so happy to be here with you all this afternoon on a topic that's very dear to my heart and for those of us at the McCormick Center for Early Childhood Leadership, which is a part of National Louis University. I am going to try to facilitate as best I can conversation between our presenters and you, our audience, and meaning makers at this session. So let me tell you a little bit about who we are and what this topic is all about. First of all, the title, Work Environments Matter. Now, many of you are working directly in programs, or you may be systems leaders working with those who are working in programs. You know that when you go into a program, you can tell whether this is a good work environment by the looks on people's faces, the energy level, etc. But one of the things that we've been focused on at the McCormick Center for the last 30 years is really addressing the quality of those work environments in a systemic way. Our presenters here today are representing both tool development for measuring organizational climate, culture, or working conditions, or systems leaders from 2 states, Oregon and Illinois, which have recently invested their time and effort in building work in their quality improvement systems addressing the work environment. And that's where we're going next. So I don't want to take a lot of time with introductions. You can see our names and where we're from on the screen. I think the next slide, please. So I work at a university. I do research, I collect research. So you'll have to excuse me for taking a moment to share with you a little bit from the research context about why we say work environments matter. The very first statement kind of shows the beginning more than 10 years ago of research that looked at the relationship between the quality of work environments and the quality of the classroom environment. For those of you involved in QRIS, and my guess is everybody in this session is involved with QRIS in one way or another, you know that our emphasis has long focused on the quality of the classroom environment and the quality of the interactions between the adults and children and children and children in those environments. QRIS has not looked or attempted to improve the quality of the work environment directly until just very recently. So I point out kind of the bookends of what we know from a research perspective. The very first research was done by Lauer and Cassidy that looked at this relationship in early childhood classrooms and the relationship to the quality of the work environment in the organization in which those classrooms sit. And that looked using environment rating scales and the early childhood work environment survey, which you'll hear more about later. The second bullet I will mention just very briefly is from 2019, and it is a report on quality rated QRIS, which is in Georgia, and it was a validation study that showed how there was this direct connection between better work environments and better quality outcomes for staff, as well as the quality of the centers in terms of their star rating. And so I highlight this. You'll have a resource where you can connect or download the actual resource, but I point this out because this is really critical of looking at work environment in a QRIS system. And it didn't use any of the tools that we're going to talk about today. It looked at some shorter survey ways of getting at the issue of staff satisfaction and commitment to the organization, and looking at turnover, wages, and benefits. So with that, just note there's a lot more research available as a handout. And I want to, at this point, turn things over to our first presenter, which is who is Marsha Hawley from the Ounce of Prevention Fund.
Thanks, Teri. I'm so glad to be here and to talk a little bit from our perspective of what we look at when someone says, well, the work environment matters. And I'm going to just give a little bit of history on where we got to where we are. And it's really important to think about why we think these organizational conditions are the things that are most important for thinking about quality improvements and what you do about it. And it's based on the work that was done by the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research. And the study that they did was back in the 1990s, where they really wanted to look at elementary schools and see why some were improving and getting better and they had great outcomes, while other schools, often in the same neighborhoods, were not. They were either declining or just staying flat. And what they did was they looked at what were the empowering, excellent practices, the implementation of strategies, and what improved outcomes. And they found that there were 5 areas of organizational mindsets, structures, and practices that were common to all of these extraordinary improving schools. And they were effective instructional leaders, collaborative teachers, engaged families, ambitious instruction, and supportive environments. And what they found was that schools that were strong in 3 to 5 of these supports were more likely to be improved as measured by students' outcomes in math and reading scores and their engagement, in other words, attendance. And a sustained weakness in any one of these essentials did not show any improvement at all. So what we did was we built off of these 5 essentials and found that, which isn't surprising in early childhood, that one of the things that emerged when we looked at this from an early childhood lens was that parent voice was really important. And it was the critical 6th element in thinking about it. And so the Early Education Essentials is a survey tool that's designed to measure and strengthen the organizational conditions that really help in improvement in early childhood programs. So if you go to the next slide, please. We're going to be looking at one of the measures that we looked at and thought about as we looked at the organizational conditions. And we thought about this whole effective instructional leaders are the key drivers of all improvement. So if you think about that, we look at this as, well, what are they that actually lifts up from stagnation, to think about that. And we developed 7 leadership standards for leaders to use as a tool of thinking about their own ways of thinking. And so if you look at these, I'd like you to just take a glance at visionary leadership, improving teaching and learning, ambitious instruction, family engagement, supportive learning environments, effective management, and ethical leadership. And if you go to the next slide, please, we're going to do a poll, and I want everybody to think about this as we look at these standards just by the description, and think about where we can look at ourselves. And so in this first poll, on the next poll that you should be seeing that should pop up, we want you to look at and think about, what standard do you feel the strongest in? Which one just resonates with you and say, I'm really good at this? To think about what it is that you're the strongest in. And the results are coming in. And what we found was that these were really important to think about. It's one of the first things we look at when we're working and talking with instructional leaders or in the system. What do you think is your strongest leadership standard that you feel really good about? And a lot of things that people would say in early childhood programs wasn't surprising, but it was also something really important. So we're going to look at the results here, and it looks like visionary leadership was the winner. And I find that wonderful, because most early childhood program leaders would choose family engagement as their strongest. And I'm not, I wonder if that's because that's something forefront in their mind in early childhood programs. Often school leaders would talk about improving teaching and learning. And it's very interesting that visionary leadership is this group's strongest instructional standards that they feel they're really good at. So I want to do another poll. If we go to the next slide and we do the second one, I want to do the second poll, which will be, which one do you feel like you need to strengthen? Which one is the one that you feel like you really need to work on, that you really need to think about, focus on, and would improve your program, your school, your system that you're working with and in charge of? So as we look at this, we can think about, well, what are some of the things that happen that, there's so many things a leader needs to think about. There's so many areas that you focus on. And so sometimes we forget, like, all right, well, where am I really strong? And where am I really going to have to think about improvement? So as you think about what it is, I think that, the important part is to think of the instructional leader is the driver of change. It is the person that leads the change effort, that really thinks about that, really looking at what you need to build and maintain the school and the levels of what you're trying to do and how you want to improve. So as we think about our winner in this one, where people are improving, it's an effective management. And that actually isn't surprising to me, because sometimes we focus on many other things. Think of the other things that are strong in this group. Ambitious instruction. This group feels pretty strong and needs to work on family engagement, needs to work on what ambitious instruction in early childhood means. But effective management is one of those areas that really is important. And this is good in terms of informing your own professional development, building of knowledge, and initiatives in other areas, and some of the things that we capitalize and build on as we work on these instructional practices and what we want to do. If we could go to the next slide, please. We're going to be looking at some of the things that I think are really important that we've done to try to think about improving all of these efforts and all of these instructional leadership standards to support these practices. And if you can tell here, we've got you first, everybody needs some information. And often we stop there. We have training, and then we have technical assistance, which really is important in terms of establishing a routine that transfers what you've learned into actual practice. And so we've really worked on thinking about how we do this to build those skills. So first, if you think about in Illinois, the 5E survey and now the early education survey is administrated through the state of Illinois to state-funded programs. And the early education essentials is really important in terms of the core of what we do to build knowledge and information on. So we found that what we can do is think about the knowledge and then technical assistance, which is to build that in, coaching or support to build that information into practice, and then a way to learn together, how important it is to think about how to build that information into your practice by listening to others who do that. And of course, we also need to think about the different kinds of tools and resources to help build this, even when someone is thinking about that and trying to build your own individual practice into a better one. In Oregon, we actually had the chance to really think about how a state system of early childhood education can really help to build the organizational conditions for continuous quality improvement. And we've learned a lot in that by working with state instructional leaders as well as site instructional leaders and people all throughout the state. And we've learned a lot about how this works, how we think about it. And yet, we also want to think about how we learn more. And if you want to learn more about this, if you go to the next slide, please. These are some of the things and strategies that the OUNCE has in terms of the survey, the Early Education Essentials, Lead, Learn, Excel, which is a 12-month fellowship that I've run for the past 8 years. Educare Best Practices Training, which is modular-based, and Achieve on Demand, which is meant for home visitors. And if you want any information about that, there's a website to go to, as well as contacting Abigail Sylvester at the OUNCE. And I think it's important that this has been translated into field-tested approaches and research-validated professional development solutions. And I'm gonna turn it over to Andi, who can share how systems can take the uptake on this and change the whole state to think more deliberately. So Andi?
Thanks, Marsha, I appreciate it. So I'm Andi Bales Molnar. I'm from Oregon, and I work at the Early Learning Division, which is part of our Department of Education. If you want to go ahead to the next slide, and I wanted to give you guys kind of an idea of where Oregon is and where we're going and how we have leaned into some of the pieces that have been provided around the early ed essentials. So if you go to the next slide, I can give a little bit of a context of where our system is at. So in Oregon, we have an early learning system that is multifaceted. It includes different kinds of publicly funded programs. So those begin with our Oregon Pre-K, which is legislated to follow the Head Start and Early Head Start performance standards. So what we are able to do is use state funds and federal funds and combine them together so that we can have Head Start and early Head Start available to more children within our state. And we also have a Head Start collaboration office that supports that work. So our OPK serve about almost about 8,000 children. The bulk of those are 3 to 5, but we are in the process of expanding our OPK to be a prenatal to pre-kindergarten program. So we've recently served 64 early Head Start P3s, but we are expanding that in the next year. We also have Preschool Promise, which is a newer publicly funded preschool program in Oregon. And that is just state funding. So it does give us a little bit more leverage in terms of local control. And it also allows us to serve children up to 200% of the federal poverty level. So that increases the amount of children that we're able to serve throughout the state. So combined with some very recent, in fact, we're still in the appeal process for those who may have applied for funding and didn't receive it. That serves about another 6,000 children. So, and in addition to that, we also have a Baby Promise program, which is up to 200% for children under 3, and we also have relief nurseries. And so all of those publicly funded programs are nestled within the ELD, as well as our professional learning system, which includes our QRIS system. We call it SPARK. It's a 5-star system. It's a portfolio-based system. That system is supported by our child care resource and referral agencies, who, in addition to many of the other things that they do to support providers in their local regions, they also conduct focused child care networks. They enroll folks for Spark. They help them move through the process, put their portfolios together, get those portfolios approved, and they are our main source of professional development through trainings currently. And then we have our early learning hubs. Until recently, our early learning hubs actually were part of our Preschool Promise system. They were the grantees for our Preschool Promise, and then they would subcontract out to providers. With this new round of funding that will be beginning in September, we're moving that actually so that Preschool Promise grantees have contracts directly with the state, and so our early learning hubs can focus more on coordinated enrollment and become more of a family resource hub. So looking at our CCR&Rs as our professional learning hub and our early learning hubs as our family learning hubs. And then Oregon Online Registry is our professional registry that not only tracks required training hours, but also evaluates professional qualifications. And so all those pieces work in tandem together with our system. I'm going to move to the next slide. I can talk a little bit about where we are going with that and how we're trying to integrate the early ed essentials into that. So over the last couple of years, our focus has been on revamping our professional learning system. It has been a priority both within the ELD, but also with the governor's office and through legislation. So we did, this would include revisions of Spark. We know, as we've all learned, that as the more QRIS systems are out there, the more we understand how continuous quality improvement may or may not be part of the system. And we've done our own internal research as well. And one thing that we have found is that a portfolio-based system may not be encouraging continuous quality improvement. And also having a system based on steps or stars may also not be encouraging that continuous quality improvement, which is something that we've been addressing. And one way we want to address that is by moving towards a competency-based system of professional development that also values job-embedded professional development and peer learning communities. So similar to what Marsha was just talking about, when you have a system that is purely based on trainings and how many hours you got for that training, and sometimes we just call it, people in seats, then where is the continuous quality improvement? Where's that cycle of learning? So we're moving towards creating a system that supports that. Some of the things that we've been able to do have been supported by a grant that originates from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, but also goes through the Ounce of Prevention Fund. And that has allowed us to investigate and learn and implement some of these early ed essential pieces. So one of them includes Lead, Learn, Excel, as Marsha just explained. In Oregon, we have completed 2 cohorts of Lead, Learn, Excel. We've done those system-wide and statewide. So what we've done is looked at how can we use Lead, Learn, Excel to support a system. And so we've had a variety of folks in different roles in those 2 cohorts, and we've learned a lot about where there's a real ease of fit and where there's some opportunities to think about the core structure of Lead, Learn, Excel and where it can meet people where they are. Our 3rd cohort is currently in process. That right now has been our most exciting cohort because it is our initial implementation of bringing Lead, Learn, Excel into our QRIS system. So into those CCR&Rs who are working within the QRIS who are helping those providers. So that's been a really exciting accomplishment for us. It's been a great learning so far. And I'm sure everybody here will say it, as March loomed and April and May came, we've learned some pivots and some adjustments as well with our Lead, Learn, Excel, and really looking at it as how can this be another tool in your tool belt to help providers even in times of crisis, and focusing in on that supporting leaders in times of crisis supports providers, it supports children, it supports families. So we're hoping to sustain Lead, Learn, Excel in the future through a train the trainer model. So having some trainers for Lead, Learn, Excel here in Oregon as a way to both retain the model but also grow the model through our region. Another way that we've looked at our early ed essentials is through some specific professional development outside of Lead, Learn, Excel. One thing we did was an ambitious instruction professional development cohort. So what we did with that is we asked the question, if we take one essential element and we dive deep with a cohort, can we see a positive change in practice? Can we see a positive change in staff retention? And would we see a positive change in instructional leadership practices? So looking at some of those key drivers of quality and programs. So we took 25 teachers. It was an application based. They had to be nominated by their instructional leader. It was an 11-month experience. We began with 4 beautiful days in Bend, Oregon, learning together and hiking and doing all these things that we didn't get to do this summer. And then we did monthly webinars. And so using the ambitious instruction definition, our work with the ounce, and we developed a framework that we wanted to focus in for ambitious instruction, and those monthly webinars focused on that. And we contracted that out with some professionals in our state that are also very skilled in tools of the mind. So that was a neat link up there in that. And so we did some surveys and did class observations of those providers. We had to change how we did our post research. We were not able to do post-class observations in May as planned, so we did surveys and some intentional interviews for those participants. And I would say our initial data shows that we've had some unexpected learnings from this. There was a high rate of turnover in our group of 25. We ended up at a group of 17. And I think that that's given us some good information about our field. A big reason people were leaving was salaries. I think our most talked about example of that is we had a really great participant, strong teacher, a Head Start teacher for a long time. She left to manage a doggy daycare because her salary got doubled. So I think it says a lot about our field and where we're at and the tough choices that people have to make. And so we also noticed that the lack of instructional leadership showed up in folks saying that they needed to back out because they didn't have time, they didn't have the workload, which was a red flag for us to think about how are we talking about ambitious instruction and these quality elements as part of the everyday work and not an extra. And I think as we move into the next year, that's on our minds more than ever. And then with the way that our program year ended, we did learn unintentionally that ambitious instruction and those quality markers were the first thing to go in a crisis, and understandably so. But that then opens up for us the question of how do we slowly bring those back? How do we continue to focus on quality? How do we continue to define quality, and who's defining it as well? So I also want to mention that the Early Ed Essentials have been part of a framework for professional development in school districts. We are working hard to bring school districts into our professional learning system. It's one of the goals of our revamp of the system, is to have school districts more involved with the ELD, to have more of a partnership. A lot of our school districts will have early learning programs that are not part of our programs. And so we want to really build those partnerships for some more sustainable futures, but also so children and families can have smoother transitions and already be part of their local school district, even though they aren't yet in kindergarten. And we also piloted the Early Ed Essentials survey that you heard Marsha refer to earlier. We did this with some of our centers that are solely funded by Oregon Pre-K, so they don't have any federal dollars or preschool promise dollars. It just gives us a little bit more control of our pilot participants. And so we did receive those survey results, and what we're doing now is looking at how do we build our TA for the next year with those survey results in place, doing some rapid increase cycles month by month, but also understanding that how programs will be operating in the fall is going to look very different than they were when the survey was taken. So the current situation has given us a lot of time to think about more creative ways to address professional learning and the importance of those collaborative networks as well. The other thing I wanted to mention is that Governor Brown has put out a numbered memo, and what she has said is that all publicly funded early learning programs must be aligned within their standards. So we have created new early learning quality standards that will be for Preschool Promise, but also for any program in K-12, and those are based on the Early Ed Essentials. So we're hoping that by bringing the Early Ed Essentials into our professional development, by bringing it into our evaluation and monitoring, and bringing it into our standards, that we'll be able to then create more of a culture of continuous quality improvement. I want to go to the next slide. So this next slide is just going to talk a little bit about how we're building up our professional learning system. So, you know, we are trying to connect our system more directly to publicly funded programs, like I talked about before. We are moving away from training and technical assistance towards job-embedded professional development. So really not, like I said, not looking at training hours in terms of your learning started at 10 o'clock and it ended at 11 o'clock. So you are 1 hour smarter than you were the day before. But looking at how do we build these into ongoing, continuous job-embedded learning that's supported by an instructional leader, and that also incorporates collaborative routines, because we know that that's another driver of high quality. We are launching an early learning coaching program for Preschool Promise that will launch out of those CCR&Rs. So again, building up them as a professional learning hub for both coaching and consultation, integrating parent voice. So as we look to revise Spark, really understanding what's important to parents, what do they want to know, how do they want to know it, and how do they want to be involved in continuous quality improvement? Where do they see their role in their program's quest to always improve? And so that's an important piece of the work we want to do, and all of that hopefully leading to a stronger culture of continuous quality improvement. We want to get away from the one-time rating. We want to really know that it's an ongoing journey, and we want to bring programs through a system of support. It's often described in Oregon, often by Deb Mathias, that we are looking to build an escalator, not a staircase or a ladder, but really how do we meet programs where they are? How do we identify what's important to them, and how do we move them towards higher levels of quality in a way that feels supportive, but also feels rewarding and professional in our mixed delivery system. So I apologize. I'm not sure who I'm supposed to hand it off to next. Teri, can you help me out?
Sure, but before I do that, I want to ask you a question.
Absolutely.
When you say that your governor is moving to have one set of standards, is that going to be true for child care programs that receive subsidy dollars?
That's a really good question, Teri, and that question has been asked a few times. Currently, our subsidy dollar system is not part of our early learning system. They're part of DHS. And so there are some folks that are looking really closely at how, when we say publicly funded, what is the total scope of that? But that's a really good question that we are looking at. And as soon as the decision is made, I'd be happy to let people know.
And maybe that'll be the next step, if it isn't initially. All right, thank
maybe,
you, Andi.
Thank
Sorry
you.
to put you on the spot. Next, we're going to move to Jill Bella, who is muted and needs to unmute, and will be sharing with you about the Early Childhood Work Environment Survey.
Thank you, Teri. I was about to forget to unmute myself, so I appreciated that. I want to just go back to the title of the session again, which is Work Environments Matter, and just share, you know, how important quality of work life is for adult staff. And we know that staff stability and quality of caregiving is linked to turnover and quality of work life. And we also know that in early care and education programs, the needs of adults tend to be forgotten. We're so focused on those children because that's the, you know, purpose of the organizations, that we tend to forget about the adults who are caring for them. But I love to use this quote from Marcy Whitebook and several of her colleagues, which is, by failing to meet the needs of the adults who work in childcare, we're threatening not only their well-being, but that of the children in their care. Because if people aren't satisfied, if they're not happy, if they're physically uncomfortable, if their needs are not being met, that impacts the children that they're working with. And that's one of the reasons why we focus on work environments and why it's so important. There's this, you know, trickle down effect. And then I also wanted to pause for a moment and just define organizational climate, which is what I'll be talking about now. Organizational climate is the distinct and the unique atmosphere that characterizes a setting. And it's distinct and unique. You will never walk into two organizations that have the exact same organizational climate. And one of the reasons is because organizational climate is made up of the collective perceptions, attitudes, beliefs, values of the individuals in a particular setting. So it's that combination, it's the composite of those personalities and all of those things that come together, in addition to the leadership style, which we know also varies among programs as well. But the word collective is really key as we're talking about organizational climate, because it is this composite of everybody who works there, their perceptions. It's not one person's opinion, it's the collection or the composite of opinions. You can flip to the next slide, please. And as Teri mentioned, we've been doing work on organizational climate at the McCormick Center for over 30 years now. And a survey was developed over 30 years ago called the Early Childhood Work Environment Survey, which measures 10 dimensions of organizational climate, which are on your screen. There's also a handout that you can access that it has the 10 dimensions, not only this list, but also a definition of each of them. So I'm not gonna take time right now to define them, but you kind of get a sense just looking at this. You know, it's how people feel about one another, the team spirit of the group, the development opportunities that are there for staff members, how people feel about the person who's leading or supervising them, how, you know, how clear policies and procedures are, et cetera. So we're going to talk about, in a moment, I'm going to talk about the survey a little bit that is given out to all staff, not just teaching staff in a program, that assesses these 10 different dimensions. But before we do that, I wanted to do a poll. So you can put up the poll. And The question is, have you ever been impacted by a negative organizational climate? And it's a simple yes, no question. So as I'm watching the poll results come in with immediacy here, most people are responding that yes, they have been impacted by a negative organizational climate. As a matter of fact, it's pretty overwhelming percentages here. We're at about 93% of people say that they've been impacted by a negative organizational climate. Those of you who haven't been are extremely fortunate, and we'll want to tap into some of the things that you've experienced that make that organizational climate so positive. But now I'd like to ask a second question. So if you can ask the next question, this one's for the chat box. So you're going to click on the bottom of your screen and you'll go to that more button there or tab and click on it, and you'll be able to click in the chat box and type your answer in. But I'd like you to list some specific examples of how a negative work climate has impacted you or staff in programs that you have observed. So how that negative work climate has impacted you or staff. I'll give you a few moments to go ahead and see what's coming in here. And I'll read some of them as people are typing away, but we've got low productivity, low trust, lack of motivation, shutting people down in meetings, they're not willing to speak, low morale, people feeling discouraged, impacts the turnover, people leaving the job, burning out, health and illness, loss of motivation. I didn't realize how depressing this was going to be when I put it in the question. I quit, oh my goodness, not willing to take risks. I actually started with migraines, so physical impacts of it due to negative supervisor relationship, high turnover, wow, low teacher attendance, lack of trust again, burnout, inconsistency, self-esteem, classroom behavior. We could go on and on, but we don't want to because it is a little depressing. But what we see here is just, you know, how important work climate is. Look at what's happening to people who are impacted by negative work climate. It's so critical, and yet it gets overlooked. There's another quote that I'm probably not going to be able to remember right now. Let me try. Which is that work climate tends to go unnoticed until something is seriously wrong. So we don't think about it, and we should be thinking about it all the time, but we don't think about it until all those negative things that you just put in the chat box start appearing, and we start getting that feedback. Then we start paying attention, and at that point, you know, we're behind. We need to, you know, get out in front of it before it becomes negative. You can flip to the next slide, please. So there are lots of benefits for assessing organizational climate or work attitudes of staff. And one of the benefits is to identify program strengths. Like, we really can see what is going well related to organizational climate. What of those 10 dimensions is working for us? We can also pinpoint areas of concern, you know, what's not working. We can help set priorities. So we can compare different sections of the assessment. We can compare different dimensions and then be able to set priorities based on the data that we're seeing. And I'm going to share with you the profile in a little bit so you'll see more specifically how we'll be able to do that. We also strongly encourage administrators to share the results of the Early Childhood Work Environment Survey, which is, we call it the EQUIS for short, so I'm probably going to start doing that. But it's the Early Childhood Work Environment Survey. We encourage those administrators, when they get the results, to share the profile. It lets people know how valuable their input was, but also they should be part of the decision-making process. And I'll show you a little bit about how people can do that in a moment. We want to use it to, one of the benefits of assessing work attitudes is to monitor the impact of change efforts, to then, you know, see our progress. How are we moving forward? And also, I think this one is kind of understated, and it's so important. It helps us one of the benefits is that we learn to understand that there are differences in perceptions. That, you know, somebody can say something and one person views it one way and somebody else views it on the entirely different end of the spectrum. Or something happens and it's viewed in two different ways, or multiple ways, not even two different ways. So there's really a lot of work goes into looking at perceptions when we talk about organizational climate and helping people understand how perceptions can be an asset to them. And then another benefit is to empower staff to be active participants in identifying and solving problems. And I already mentioned, we really encourage this look at organizational climate to be global, to be done by the entire organization and everybody that's involved, and help them kind of have conversations about it and take an active role in making changes for the better. So a lot of benefits come out of assessing work attitudes. I'm gonna, well, first I'll share with you, you know, I mentioned that this is a survey that's given to all of the staff in a program. And they're asked questions related to each dimension, and they're kind of pointed questions. There's positive and negative statements, and they check, you know, all that apply related to the dimension of, say, collegiality or supervisor support. And then a profile is generated. And so I wanted to give you a glimpse of the profile to show you how it can be used. So if you can flip to the next slide, you'll see the first page of the profile here. And it's got demographic information at the top of it. But part A is that the second half of it, what you see there. And what you see is how people ranked each of the 10 dimensions. So the 10 dimensions are listed on the bottom of the chart. And on the left side of the chart, you see a scale of 0 to 10. And then in the middle of the chart, you see these lines. And the lines tell you where people rated each dimension. So for the first dimension on the left, there is collegiality. You'll see that the range was, and I even can't see it well with my glasses on, but it looks like it was between a 5 to a 9. And so that tells you that at least one person in that staff rated it a 5, and at least one person rated it a 9. The little blue tab in the middle there is where the average is. So actually, it's kind of right, that tab is almost right there in the middle at a 7, which is halfway between the 5 and the 9. So that gives you some information, a short range on collegiality. So most people are feeling about the same, and it's pretty positive. But then I want you to look at another line. So let's look at, let's go over to task orientation, which is on the far right, it's the third one from the right. So it's the long line, third one from the right. And what that shows you is at least one person gave this dimension a 1, and at least one staff member gave it a rating of a 10. So that's quite a spread. So lots of different perceptions going on related to task orientation. So then we look at where the average is, and we see the average is at 5, which is right there in the middle. Looking at the last dimension on the far right, which is innovativeness, you'll see it's a very short line, highly rated by pretty much everybody, rated it between a 7 and a 10. And so people are feeling confident with that. So that just gives you a little bit of information. As staff, you know, most people tend to look at, oh, what's our lowest? So looking at the 2 lowest averages, we've got professional growth and physical setting, or the third one is task orientation. So keep those 3 in mind. So the lowest ones were professional growth, task orientation, physical setting. Now we're going to look at the next slide. And what you see in this next slide is there's at the top of it, which you'll see how people kind of came together and what they thought were the 3 most important dimensions to them. So I look for the highest numbers when I look at Part B, and I see 12 people said opportunities for professional growth was one of the highest dimensions for them. And 7 people, the next highest number, said that physical setting and sufficient materials was important to them. And then I'm looking, the third one was involved, it was tied. It looks like there was a tie, if my glasses are working right, for involvement in decision-making and equitable pay and benefits. So I look at those first two highest ones, opportunities for professional growth and physical setting. And if you remember from Part A, those two, if you flip back to Part A, were two dimensions that were rated the lowest. So as a staff, that might be, and as an administrator, I might look at that and say, wow, if those two were rated the lowest and the majority of people felt that they were the most important dimensions to them, that might be a place to start, because if we can make changes there, we're going to satisfy a lot of people. So this is just one of the ways you can use the profile. Just to briefly touch on the other parts of it, Part C is about commitment to the organization. What we know is that commitment is very important. It's tied to turnover, tied to attitudes, tied to how people do their jobs. And then Part D looks at how the current environment resembles the ideal environment. So again, when we look at that, we see on the left-hand side of that chart, at the bottom is not at all like my ideal, then somewhat like my ideal, and the ideal. And we notice on this chart too, it just so happens in this sample that professional growth and physical setting, again, came out as two of the dimensions where they're not at all like people's ideal. So big red flags as to what areas in this particular sample to work on. You flip to the third, or the next slide, the third page of the profile, what you'll see is at the top of it are statements having to do with educational goals and objectives. And so this is giving people information about, you know, where they stand in what they feel are the most important educational goals and objectives of the program. So for this part, you really want to make sure that people are on the same page and that they're on the same page with what truly are your objectives and your goals of the program. You might have somebody who's, you know, an outlier there, and then you might want to have a conversation and find out, like, what, you know, why there isn't alignment between what they think are the goals and what are the goals and objectives of the program. Part F looks at decision-making influence, and it looks at, in the light blue is the perceived degree of decision-making influence of staff, and the dark blue is their desired degree of influence and decision-making. And so you want them to line up. And even if they line up at a low ranking, that's okay, because what that means, like if you look at the two bars in the very middle, as far as determining program objectives, they want some influence, and they feel that currently they have some influence. So you don't need to do anything with that particular area. But where you see discrepancies, that's where you might want to focus attention. So for example, interviewing and hiring staff, they feel that they don't have much influence and they would like more influence. There's a big bump between those two. So that might be an area to look at and have conversations about staff about what would that look like? How would they be involved more in that process? You can move to the next slide. Oh, I didn't talk about the last part. The last part asks people to identify certain words that describe their climate, their center as a place to work. And you'll notice it just puts down the highest, the words that came up with the highest frequency. But you'll notice that, you know, some of those words, some people might consider positive and other people might consider negative. So it brings about a conversation. For example, some people might feel fast-paced, like it's too fast-paced, and that's a negative work environment, and other people might really like that. So you'd want to have a conversation about that and how they define those things. All right, you can move to the next slide. So next, what I wanted to do was talk about the options for improving organizational climate and outcomes for children, and what we've done with this information, how we've used it over the years. And I want to start with the circle on the right-hand side there that says program consultation. So We consult with programs and give them information, help them analyze the profile if they need help doing that, give them some pointers, give them some ideas about how to help staff, have discussions with staff about it and move forward and deciding what areas they want to work on. We also do dimension-specific staff development. So focusing in and doing professional development on different dimensions based on what their needs are and providing some technical assistance related to that. Probably the way we've used this the most has been through administrator community of practices. So for 27 years now, we've had Taking Charge of Change, which is a leadership academy for administrators, primarily in the state of Illinois because it's funded to be in the state of Illinois, but we also occasionally open it up for outsiders to come to as well. And we also do a hybrid model of it now virtually and in other states. But we collect pre and post data on the early childhood work environment survey. So the directors who are part of the program, they give that survey out to their staff, let the staff know to be as candid as possible that they're going to be using this information to make improvements. It's part of a project that they're doing. And then they get $500 to do a quality improvement project. And it's based on primarily results of their pre-QRIS assessment, as well as they do a pre-self-assessment of the program administration scale. And so they use that to then decide, and our goal is to have them decide with the staff what area they want to use that money for and what they want to improve. And so then for the rest of it's an 11-month leadership academy, they work with a coach, they work with their staff, and they work on that quality improvement project. And then at the end of at the culminating event, they present their results to their community of practice. So that's another way that information can be used. Also, I put up there just doing a quality improvement plan on your own. You don't have to be part of a community of practice to do a quality improvement plan using the results. And then also using resources, so sharing books, articles, informal assessments of other things related to each of the dimensions, activities and exercises, sharing that with administrators and staff based on the dimensions that they're interested in. There's a book that goes along with the early childhood work environment survey called The Great Place to Work that has a bunch of exercises and tips related to each dimension in it as well. And then there's also one-on-one administrator coaching that can be done. So coaches can work one-on-one with administrators to come up with a plan for making improvements and to help them work with their staff and come up with ideas for how to do that. I guess I want to kind of end with just saying that many directors who take part in quality rating and improvement systems or QRIS initiatives state that their teachers feel that every move is being observed and rated, right? They're getting observed in their classrooms all of the time, and we assess the learning environments, we assess the interactions with children, we create individual learning plans for improvement with those teaching staff, but seldom do we ask their opinion about the quality of the work life and how significant that is and how important it is for us to be asking those questions. We need to start focusing on that and really working on making continuous quality improvement based on their quality of work life. Because again, as I stated at the beginning, their quality of work life, how they are feeling impacts those children and impacts the outcomes for the children. I'm going to end there and turn it over to Tom Lehman from the state of Illinois, and I'll do him a favor too. You're on mute, so be sure to unmute yourself, Tom.
Thank you. So the big picture of where we are in Illinois is that we're piloting new QRIS standards that really make room for the practices and the instruments that have been described in this workshop. We started thinking about emphasizing the I in QRIS back during Race to the Top. And as you see, we changed the name of our system from quality rating to quality recognition and improvement. And so we have some experience in how those changes worked since about 2014. And what we found is that our system is quite good at sorting high quality programs from less high quality programs. But it's not very good at encouraging less high quality programs to move to higher levels. So we started looking at that in our QRIS committee of the Early Learning Council. And maybe we should go to the next slide. And we discussed what we really want to see at a center level. Our committee included a lot of technical assistance people who started jumping into how we should change our technical assistance, and we sort of stopped and said, no, let's really be clear on what we want to see at the center level. And you have a handout that you may or may not want to refer to, but it's the first one on there called CQI component categories, and it lists 8 categories of leader behavior that we ended up with that are essential for continuous quality improvement. And the interesting story is we started with the last one, number 8, which is lead weekly or monthly improvement cycles using data. So this is plan, do, review, or plan, do, study, act. After some discussion, people in our group said, wait a minute, there's something you have to do first. There are administrative pieces, pieces like establish regular protected time for communication, reflection, and planning, and develop teams and share leadership. So we laid out a few other categories in the administrative side, and then one of my favorite of our committee members said, no, it's not going to work. And this was a person who supervises what we call our quality specialists, the people who go out and help programs. And she said, when we try to help programs that don't have a culture of improvement, we're just spinning our wheels. So we added our third section, which is lead by example to build organizational climate or work environment. And when you get a chance to look at the handout, you'll see that they're in the other order because the fundamental one is that one, to build the organizational climate, and then to establish some administrative practices, and then to look at the pedagogical side of plan, do, review, or plan, do, study, act sorts of meetings. Interestingly, I was trying, as a person taking notes, I was trying to organize how all this would fit together, and I remembered the whole leadership framework, which was developed by the McCormick Center. Teri Talan is the co-chair of our committee that I'm describing, but she did not do it. I did it. So she was not promoting her view or her organization's view, but it really fits to look at the whole leadership framework, which talks about leadership essentials, which is gets to the organization climate, administrative leadership, and then pedagogical leadership. So, okay, let's go to the next slide. And I'm going to skip the next slide. You can see what's on it and go to the next slide. What we're piloting. So, as I say, our standards, our new standards that we're piloting are trying to make room and for this fundamental set of activities around establishing a work environment or organization culture. our first important decision on doing that was to move assessments from the end of the improvement process, where scores on assessments like environment rating scales would have high stakes consequences. They would determine your public recognition and if you're a child care center, your rate add-on for quality. And we decided to put those at the beginning of the process. So a program taking a step forward and saying, I'd like to move to the next level, we would provide them with assessments. And in the pilot, it's going to be these three that you see here, but there's room in our standards for the early ed essentials and others that have been developed. So you'll see that the work environment survey really gets to those leadership essentials. You'll see that the administrator role perception survey, which is also a McCormick Center instrument, gets at the administrative piece, and then the environment rating scales, which are so important because that's the real opportunity for the whole staff to get involved and form teams and think about what they're going to do. Our state assessment team for environment rating scales is housed at the McCormick Center, and they have come up with a plan to start in this pilot with one of the subscales that they can do entirely on video or photos, and conduct training along with the assessment, and along with kind of a community of practice, a virtual community of practice, because this is not a high stakes assessment. So we don't have to do everything according to the book. We can help program leaders and program staff look at what the standards say, just make some decisions on where they'd like to improve, and then move forward with the guidance of our new standards and our support people. And you see the processes for CQI there, community of practice, coaching, and job embedded professional development. So our standards, in essence, are looking at whether a program is working to improve every week or every month. And we're not finalizing a standard based on some score, because as we all know, and I used to be a center director, you can, you put on your good clothes and smile for the photo, and that's what happens with a final assessment. But in this case, we're not making the assessment results public. The centers can just use them for their improvement. And so our full set of standards really arises from this handout that I referred to. Teri, you are our co-chair in this process. Do you want to add anything?
I do. It's really hard for me to keep my mouth shut. I want to just say a couple things that kind of relate to both what Andi and mentioned about some of the lessons learned. And that is that this pilot that we're doing is piloting something that isn't connected to work environment, but is connected to work environment indirectly. And that is salaries, because these pilots are all going to be funded through contracts for the child care subsidy program as opposed to vouchers. And they will have a salary paid, may not be as high as we would like. I still haven't seen the final numbers, but they're more aligned to what quality standards would dictate for compensation. And they build in adequate staffing so that there's time for teaching staff to meet and plan, which is something that is hardly ever addressed in anybody's quality rating and improvement system, is the idea of having enough staff to do the quality work that we know is so important. So I wanted to just say that the goal here is some of the carrot is really addressing the reimbursement rate, the compensation piece, so that there can be focused attention on how to address both work environment and climate, as well as classroom quality and professional development for the leader about how to create the kind of place that staff want to stay. Because we know that compensation is important, but commitment, that first slide that where I showed the Georgia quality rated evaluation showed that higher quality programs have staff that have higher levels of commitment, lower turnover, and better salaries. So oftentimes we spend so much money and effort working on instructional practices, but if the staff leave as soon as they can get a better paying job, what have we accomplished? So it's an and with that we need to do both. We need to focus on classrooms and instructional practices at the same time as we address salaries, compensation, and the quality of the work environment. So that's the piece that I would add to what you said, Tom. I guess at this point, what we'd like to do is open it up for questions, or for people on our panel to ask questions of each other based on the presentation. So maybe before we open it up to our participants, does anybody want to ask a question on the panel or a comment?
I just wanted to ask Tom, did you have one more slide that you wanted to show?
Thank you. I did, but I don't want to use it, so you can skip right over it.
Okay.
Thank you, Jill. We're good. I keep the process moving. So if no one else on the panel wants to make a comment, or I think that the thing that we should do is open it up to our participants. And I think the best thing to do would be to raise your hand or somehow indicate that you want to speak, and then we'll unmute you. If people are thinking about what they might want to ask, I would just comment that we had such a wealth of people's heartfelt responses about negative work environments that I'd love to hear, were any of those work environments improved, addressed, and if so, how was that done? So if you had that experience, it would be great for you to share it.
I see a hand up, Teri. Kimberly Brown has her hand up.
Okay. I'm not seeing that same one. How do I do this? Do I need to do something?
Teri, if you bring up your participant list, you can see who raised their hand. So Kimberly, okay. You can unmute yourself and ask your question, okay, and come on video if you are able.
I'm not able.
Okay.
For the, I'm sorry, I can't remember your name, but the gentleman from Illinois, Tom, and he was talking about how they moved their assessments from the end of the process to the beginning of the process. I just wanted a little bit of clarification with that. So the process, when you do that assessment at the beginning, that's not the official state assessment, is it? Is that something that your CCR&Rs are doing?
Yes, so it is performed by our official state team, but it's only for the benefit of the center. It's not made public. We have yet to determine whether we're using these assessments at all in the final stages. I think at our lower levels of steps, we will not, all we want to see is, are you working to improve? And Teri will put it on our committee agenda when we get to really the top levels, if we will require a final assessment, you know, passing a score.
If I could add to that, Tom, the beauty of having the assessments be formative rather than, you know, summative and judgmental is we give our participant centers very accurate information based on assessments by the state external team. And then that team, because they're not high stakes, can give actual real feedback to the programs themselves, because it's not high stakes. So we don't have this need to separate the data collector from the, you know, sharer of feedback. And so it's much more immediate and it's much clearer, because it's not like playing phone tag where you have an intermediary who has to interpret the information that's shared from a state assessor. So that's part of this new process that we'll be piloting in Illinois.
It's almost backwards from any other system. You know, it's because it's all, yeah, how do you rate something is the question. So it's really nice to be able to take these concepts of, you know, how do you really work towards improvement? And if you start with what are the conditions, what is the climate, and we know that that really has a direct impact on whether people stay and whether children learn. I think we're going to be going in the right direction by thinking about it in that way.
I guess
I also want to make a
question,
comment. Was that your question?
I was saying that I guess what I'm missing is that when you do it from that perspective, how knowledgeable are those programs about the ERS scale? How were they prepared to go into the assessments if they have not been exposed to the information prior to the assessment?
So that's a very key question, which we didn't fully answer when we developed the pilot. And the assessment team keeps coming to me and saying, we need more money, we need more money. So we are going, we're building that in now, that along with, and actually the COVID-19 crisis has allowed us sort of flexibility to do this, because we're just kind of shifting anyway, and we're going to virtual systems. So yeah, we'll do some training first on what these scales mean, and then we'll provide some data.
So we had a question. Oh.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, I think that states typically begin with orienting and training the directors, and then it's on any scale they're employing in the QRIS. And then they begin to go deeper and deeper into the lead teachers, the assistant teachers, so that everybody really understands the metrics. But I think that the point we're making is that it's how you use the data for quality improvement that's the key. You know, the data in and of itself, without the ability to really use it and think about how it informs your improvement, I think that's where the key lies. And the deeper you can be in the staffing complement with people understanding the whys about a scale. Why is that item in there? Why does that lead to best practice? Why is that important in what we're doing? Unfolds people's deeper understanding. I think when we originally conceived this session, we were thinking about there are a lot of tools out there that quality improvement specialists and technical assistant individuals can use to support program improvement. And at the state or community level, wherever the decisions are being made, a good understanding of the different types of tools what they're getting to, what is the purpose of the tool. I remember, like Tom said, I was a center director for 27 years myself, and I would go through a series of tools to see a lot of them being Paula Doherty Bloom's and the McCormick Center's tools, to see what new insights do I gain by employing that tool, looking like Jill was talking about at the results, thinking through with the team and the program, what is this telling us and how does it lead us to next steps of improving the program. So what we were trying to share with you today is that there are a lot of different tools and approaches you can employ, and it's the thoughtful selection and detailed implementation, whether you're beginning with a pilot or beginning to implement the tools as a menu of options that a director and a team might select from based on where they want to grow their program and improve it. But these were some of the tools of the trade that have been out there, well proven, and can help programs gain insights about developing their own quality. So I'm just throwing that out there.
To answer a question in the chat box, it's the learning activities subscale in the ERS ECHRS 3 that we're beginning with. And
Yeah.
The assessment team would love to, they're planning to do that virtually.
Yeah. And it's going to be, this is one of those things where we're making lemonade out of lemons. And the idea of the COVID-19 crisis is giving us an opportunity to innovate how we can collect data, help programs receive and make sense of data, and continue with continuous improvement that means something to them. And that's, I think we're really excited to be able to see what we can do virtually until this piece is over. And I know I've said it before, but I know it sounds highfalutin, and yes, there's money involved. You heard Andi talk about money from, I don't remember if it was Gates Foundation or one of the big foundations, and the ounce, and what's going on in Illinois is federal preschool development grant money. But like Georgia, in their situation, they didn't have specific money for dealing with this, but they were able to utilize some tools that could really look at how there is this relationship about work environment. And then some of the things that need to be done don't have to be cost prohibitive. That's the word I'm looking for. And I would really encourage states that are intrigued, reach out to us, and we can help you with tools that are a place to begin. But even like quality specialists could have a box of tools that they could use with programs in a much more informal way. So I don't want people to feel intimidated by these two states. We're just two examples, and there's lots of ways to approach this that are really valuable.
There's nothing like learning about a set for a director about 2 or 3 different options of tools or way you could proceed, and taking that to your staff and engaging around what would those tools bring to our program, where do we see the value, exploring that together. And you're exploring the tools, and it's teaching you all something as a team together too, as you make decisions about what tool would help us chart a course to our improvement. So this has been just so very, very exciting. I'd like to thank our panel for all this information. I could talk with each and every one of you for about 2 hours about all this, and probably have. But we do have some polls here about feedback on the session that before you drop off, we'd like you to quickly go in and answer. but please give us some verbal comments in the chat box about what you're thinking, how you're feeling, what was useful, how we could improve the sessions. Just like you, we're all lifelong learners and trying to get better at what we're doing. But just thank you to our panel here for sharing your insights, your ideas, and we certainly appreciate the time it took you to prepare for this session and get on camera with us and share your insights today. So thank you so much. And there are 2 questions on this poll here for evaluation, and please make sure to share your thoughts. Thank you.